As I give this lecture on Asian and Islamic, African, Oceanic, and American art, I want you to think about the functions of art, and as we look at different works, try to think about what categories they could fall under. Those functions from your text were worship and ritual, commentary, commemoration, art for persuasion, art for delight, art for self-expression. And I also want you to think about the fact that most of this work was intended to be integrated into daily life. And in a museum, since the work wasn't made to be in a museum, the work is taken out of context, taken out of the activities that it would have been a part of and the functions that it would have had, even possibly the countries where the work was made. And is that a worthwhile price to be paid? So you can think about that question. Most, if not all, of the art in this lecture would not have been produced for museums. So beginning in India, the Buddha, Siddhartha, lived in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE in India, and he responded to the suffering around him by leaving his life of wealth and wandering into the wilderness as an ascetic. So he looks at suffering and wonders, what can I do? And that's his solution. He then attains enlightenment and begins to teach the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. Life is suffering. Suffering has a cause, which is ignorance. This ignorance can be overcome. And fourth, the way to overcome ignorance is through the Eightfold Path of right view, right resolve, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. This is a sculpture. This is a bodhisattva. The bodhisattvas are those who have almost achieved enlightenment in Buddhism, but instead of crossing over, they dedicate themselves to helping others. And this sculpture shows the influence of the Greek technique of depicting fabric clinging to a body and the body showing through. So you can see that here. Fabric is clinging to the body and the knee is showing through, similar to in these sculptures. Another important religion in India is Hinduism. And Hinduism, we often assume it has many gods, but rather than having many gods, there is one divine universal spirit, Brahman, who is unknowable and cannot be depicted. But his manifestations can be, and he has many manifestations. Shiva is one of those avatars. This is a sculpture of Shiva as king of the dance. And the third eye here is a representation of divine wisdom. Multiple arms tell of his power. He displays cosmic energy, but is perfectly balanced and composed with, on one foot. And the circle of fire is surrounding him. And these sculptures of either the Buddha or Shiva fall under the category of art for worship and ritual. We don't know what the individual craftsmen were thinking about these pieces, because rather than imbuing them with self-expression or the emotions of the individual artist, the artist had to follow the conventions of the traditions for which they're producing. This sculpture, for example, has many, many copies that are not necessarily copies of this one, but many sculptures that look very similar to this exist. And so the artist wasn't trying to express his or her individual emotions, but instead was just working within a convention. Shiva as king of dance is cast in bronze in the 11th century CE. And the Shang dynasty in China developed highly sophisticated bronze casting techniques in the 12th century BCE. So it's very early and very significant. Here's the image of bronze casting techniques that we've already seen. And what happens is you create this wax sculpture. Say, for example, you make it in wax and you put a mold around it. And then somehow you melt the wax out of the mold. So the wax drips out of the mold, usually through heat. Then when the mold is empty, you pour in the hot metal into the mold, because you've got that shape, and then you break the mold and you have bronze once the bronze cools. So that's how bronze casting works. The Chinese also excelled in ceramic arts, and these impressive terracotta sculptures are soldiers, each with individual features, buried with their Qin emperor for the afterlife. Buddhism comes to to China from India in the 3rd century BCE, and it's during a time of social unrest. So it's appealing because it's a way to transcend suffering. Confucianism is also an important philosophy in China. Confucius sought a well-ordered society through hierarchical relationships. And Taoism, on the other hand, tried to transcend the world and obtain union with nature. It didn't believe that right relationships were necessarily even possible, because whatever we strove for, we would end up making things worse through our unintended consequences. And this painting by Fan Kuan, it's called Travelers Among Mountains and Streams, and it unites these strands of Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. The figures in the image are there only to call attention to the imposing size of the mountain. You can hardly see them in this image because they're so small. They're only really important in relation to the real story, which is the mountain itself. The main focus is the mountain. That's the subject of the painting. And the people are part of nature. The image is not nature devoid of humans, but they're insignificant. There's also a waterfall here, the straight vertical line that enhances the height of this mountain. Taoism is expressed in Ma Yuan's painting through the emptiness. He also shows atmospheric perspective, if you remember that term, where things in the distance are hazier, and kind of asymmetrical composition. During the Song dynasty in China, there were traditional court painters who painted to please the taste of the court, and then there were literati painters, and this is an example of a literati. They emphasized personal expression. So that was the goal of many literati painters. They wanted to express themselves as individuals. So those artists were interested in innovation and spontaneity, just like many artists of the 20th and 21st centuries. In Japan, the traditional religion is Shinto, but Zen Buddhism also comes to Japan from China. And Zen means meditation, and influenced the pure, lonely, serene spirit of the landscapes that we see here by Sesshu Toyo. So sort of serenity and emptiness. Japanese art in general is known for its asymmetry and boldness, as well as its humor, and this woodblock print shows some of that asymmetry and boldness. It's part of the floating world style, and Japanese prints influenced such artists as Van Gogh in Europe in the 20th century. And in addition, Japanese architecture, as you can see here, influenced Frank Lloyd Wright. So now we'll move towards the west, to the desert outside of Mecca, where the Prophet Muhammad in 570 to 632 CE received visions from God. Islam means submission to God's will, and those who follow Islam are called Muslims. And Islam spread rapidly during the 7th century. It made its way from Persia all the way over to Spain, Egypt, Tunisia, a lot of these places, Syria, and the Middle East, are Islamic to some extent. The diverse cultures that were incorporated into the religion made for a rich artistic melding of different styles. There was also an influence of the fact that Islam was aniconic, meaning against images. They weren't against images, but Muhammad, when he rid the Kaaba of its pagan idols, extended that ban on idols to a discouragement of all figural imagery. So Islamic artists, at least religiously motivated artists, were limited in their subject matter. And the limitation then allowed them to excel in surface decoration and ornament. So here's an example from Iran, from Persia. So abstract geometric designs were one avenue. Color, pattern, repetition. Organic forms were another. This is from Spain, to give you that sense of the scope of Islamic art. Script, the rendering of text. Islam emphasized reading and studying the Quran, and reading the Word of God is an act of religious devotion. Thus, the art of calligraphy developed as a way of reverencing the Word of God. So organic forms, abstract designs, and script became important in Islamic art. So that kind of abstraction came out of the ban on figural imagery in religious art. Once again, much of the art in this chapter on Islamic art is devoted to worship and ritual. Abstract artists today sometimes find inspiration in religious art. So there's that sense of abstraction being able to transcend the visible. And sacred geometry is one example. Geometric designs of Islamic decoration represent eternity and transcendence. This is a video from 2003 by an artist. And also, there was an example in your text of Iranian artist Charles Hossein Zenroudi, who uses calligraphy to construct his paintings, so also influenced by Islamic calligraphy. Now, figurative imagery does not completely go away. It does play a part in some Islamic art, most commonly in small-scale paintings, what we often call miniature paintings. So now moving to Africa, we've already visited Africa in Egypt in this course, and stereotypes against Africans have plagued art historians. The discipline began in Europe. Europeans assumed that they were superior to all other cultures, that Greek art was the ideal, and so they thought that any culture that did not create realistic observations of the human body were inferior. So African art was seen as primitive. But the fact is that even that stereotype can be thrown out, if only based on the fact that representational arts did flourish in Africa. As you can see here, this is just as realistic as any Greek sculpture. But we can also question whether or not we should elevate that as the only standard for art, realism. So the Nok culture in sub-Saharan Africa developed the ability to smelt iron. They also had technical skills demonstrated in terracotta, which is clay. And then in Nigeria in about 800 CE, the Yoruba city of Ife became the home of incredibly naturalistic sculpture. Ife influenced the city-state of Benin, 150 miles away, which started a tradition, this is the Benin head, a tradition of memorial sculpture like that of Ife. The ruler, or Oba, began a tradition of casting memorial heads. The most naturalistic heads were actually created earlier at a time when they were closer to the Ife tradition. And then as time went on, the artists became less attached to the Ife tradition, and the heads became larger, thicker, heavier, and more stylized, and the beads began to increase. Number of beads began to increase. This is carved in ivory, and the mudfish in the crown of this Ioba, which means Oba's mother, have the ability to mediate between water and land, which makes them a metaphor for the Oba. The Oba was one who mediated between the human world and the supernatural world. So the mudfish are alternating with the heads of the Portuguese who traded with Africa and helped this particular king expand his kingdom. A sculpture such as this one uses almond shapes to design its composition and influence 20th century artists such as Pablo Picasso. He was very influenced by African masks. The antelope headdresses of this Bamana people in Mali are a key example of that question about museums. Why is it that museums cannot tell the whole story of many works of art? It's because these headdresses are worn during ceremonies, agricultural ceremonies, for the purpose of imitating mythical creatures who taught humans to cultivate crops. So by imitating those mythical creatures, there's hope for good crops. In a museum, this work is completely divorced from that ritual context for which it's made. The work is essentially meaningless outside of that context. These works are not meant to be hung on a wall or contemplated in a museum. They're meant to be worn and performed with and used. Now turning to the Americas. The Nazca in Peru are best known for their colossal earthworks. This is a huge earthworks, and we don't know why they made them, especially considering that they could not get up in an airplane, as one person did here, and see these pieces for themselves. So there's a speculation that these earthworks had ceremonial functions, but just like with Stonehenge, we don't really know what they're for, but we see the incredible drive and determination of human beings to use the earth around them to create vast and remarkable works of artistic expression. The same can be said of the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio. It would have been made at least 300 years after this Nazca hummingbird, 300 years after. And it was made by hauling and molding vast amounts of earth. All the more impressive today because they lack the technology that we have. In another part of the United States, the Pueblo civilization flourished. We've already seen this image, sort of like the Lascaux caves, but this is called a petroglyph. From 7,000 to 5,200 BCE. Pueblo pottery and a Navajo blanket are both examples of native art that also functioned within the society. They were functional works, as is the robe that tells the story of Matotopi's exploits. And because it tells a story, it could be considered a form of commemoration or possibly commentary or persuasion. So continue to investigate Chapter 20 in order to answer the discussion question for this week, which is to explain how art functions in Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, and to describe art's integral role into the daily activities of native cultures in Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. And if you want to comment on the question about the museum as well, that's also a possibility.